Right, okay, we're going to start again. Well, I really enjoyed watching that film again. That's my 5th time of watching it now. So, a few questions that I've, I mean, I'd be quite interested to know, Robin, what got you going initially? What was your, what kind of set you off on that path of filmmaking? What was that?
On that particular theme, or filmmaking generally?
Generally.
Well, I thought I was going to be an artist, and I went to Paris in the early 50s. And at that time, there were lots of ateliers belonging to the great painters of the time, Matisse and Fernand Léger and so on, where you could, for £20 a week, enroll. And the great master would come in and look at your work and say something reasonably rude usually. And he also would give a lecture once a week, and it was a very nice way of spending a student year in Paris. But I was a figurative artist, and I couldn't really adjust to abstract impressionism, which was at that time happening. I mean, obviously we'd had impressionism for decades, but the thing of taking scrambled eggs and throwing them at the canvas didn't particularly appeal to me. So you couldn't get yourself arrested as a figurative artist at that time, either in New York or in Paris or London. So moving to films seemed like something that might work for me. So I started to do that with the National Film Board of Canada, which was a marvelous documentary company, hugely well funded by the Canadian government, and with every conceivable facility that you wouldn't find in a film school anywhere, even today. And I was lucky enough to work with them for, I wrote and directed for them. And it took me all over Canada and finally down to New York, where I went into television. And it's always been a strange thing that Americans always want to give English people sort of classic work to do, I was always dying to do Route 66 and found myself doing Shakespeare or the Ramayana in India or something like that. And it was rather frustrating in a way. I was interested, actually, because of these debates in a memory of those days when I was actually doing a highly commercial thriller in which there was a lady with a big scar on one side of her face. So when you looked at her from this angle, she was beautiful. When you turned her head, she looked ghastly. And it happened that at that moment they were having the debates, the first debates in America, but in this case between Senator Kennedy and Vice President Nixon. And I needed a really good makeup man to handle this scar that she had, because it was very hot and she perspired, and the scar kept on coming off her face. And so I sent for a very, very, very good a makeup man who happened to be working in Chicago and was preparing to make up the vice president. And I called and said, could he spare just a few hours for me with my problem? And I was making this film in Detroit at the time. Anyway, he said, well, I've got to be on the whatever it was, plane, because I have to be back for Nixon. Anyway, the heat was ghastly, and we couldn't keep this damn scar on our face. And he missed the plane. And Nixon, everyone said the following morning, looked sweaty and...
That was your fault.
So when I tell that story to my Republican friends or relations, they're absolutely livid.
One thing I know that we've talked about this before, but when you're in America, I think it was America when you were doing commercials, things like that, and you did was it a cigarette commercial with Marilyn Monroe?
Yes, well, sort of. I worked with a wonderful photographer who some of you may have heard called Richard Avedon as my cameraman. Well, he wasn't cameraman exactly, but he lit everything, and we took care of the technology because he was, as you know, a stills cameraman, not a stills photographer, not a movie cameraman, but a wonderful photographer and an extremely nice man. Anyway, he and I occasionally did commercials together, and the reason why we did commercials, you may well understand, is that we made about 10 times as much money as in any other medium, because commercials were made at cost plus 40%. So whatever the budget came to, you simply added 40 at the end, and very nice it was. Anyway, we were making a commercial for Spring cigarettes. Cigarette advertising was still allowed. And the idea was the whole thing should be like a Greek vase, or vase as my clients called it, and a series of figures were following each other, trying to get the person ahead to take a cigarette, and it had to be shot from the waist down. So it suggested we had to use dancers. And it was all in one movement and one shot. And while we were at this meeting, Richard said, and I think we should shoot it in slow motion. And so I thought, oh God, because it actually meant that we had to take 3 times as far to produce the slow motion as if we were just shooting an ordinary dance. And I cast the most brilliant black dancer. We're talking before the Civil Rights Act went through, or even its great hero was shot. It was quite early on. And the people who owned the cigarette company were called Lorillard, and they were from the South, very much from the South. And they left the casting of their heroine to me. And so I had this gorgeous black girl in golden tights. So you couldn't tell that she was black. And she wore long white gloves, with her dress which had panels. And when they came on, I'm sorry, I actually added that in order to shoot this huge long shot, we had to have the largest cyclorama available in Los Angeles. Very, very long. And Avedon, who kept on saying these things which were virtually undoable in the world of film, but okay in the world of fashion photography, he said, there will be no shadows. Well, the largest light that we use in the cinema is called the brute, well called. It's a huge thing, and it stamps on any shadows. And we had about 14 of these in a row for this dance. And we were ready, we rehearsed, and the client arrived. Well, the client was about 14 people from the advertising agency, 14 people from Lorillard. And they said, oh yes, they call the commercial the new blonde in town because of blonde tobacco. And they said, where's our blonde? And there was this gorgeous black girl in corset we brought. It nearly had a fit. So I said, well, you will never know she's, not blonde because we're shooting her from the waist down. She's a wonderful dancer. She's got golden legs and these gloves. And they said, well, we know she's not our blonde. And Richard said, well, I tell you what, we'll get Marilyn to come along and make blonde noises. And Marilyn had just done that wonderful film with Yves Montand, and also, by the way, Some Like It Hot, where she goes boop, boop, de boop. So she came to the studio in New York, his studio, and we had a day of her going boop, boop, de boop. And almost the whole of the advertising agency, almost the whole of the L'Oreal staff, sitting on little golden chairs with their mouths open. And when she came in, I thought she was a cleaning lady. She wore a sort of, I don't know, nondescript scarf over her hair. The moment she spoke, you knew who she was. And she did the noises for us, and that is the only time she ever appeared in a commercial. By the way, the cigarette didn't go.
Fascinating, yeah, amazing. Anyway, to get onto the film, I mean...
Our film.
Our film, yeah. I learnt a lot doing the film. I learnt a lot about the business of making films, which I never realised, I mean, mainly through you, just how difficult it is to get a film up and running. And I think that is an amazing achievement to get that, because it was quite a long process, wasn't it? From, you know, getting the idea to actually starting shooting it.
Well, if we didn't have to finance it, it wouldn't be too difficult.
No, that's right.
But financing is enormously difficult, and it's complicated by the fact that in Britain, those films that are not financed by the Americans, and a very large proportion are just financed by the American studios, have to be financed, well, they don't have to be, but usually are, by immensely complicated tax arrangements, so that people put up money, you know, to save taxes. And the government, not only this government, but the government before it and the government before that, keep on moving the goalposts. And people who put a lot of money into the film find that for some reason the tax people have made a mistake, and rather like the people who are running the railway did at the moment. And so they lose their money. So that makes it even more difficult to raise. So yes, but you have to go through that. It's one of the crosses you have to bear if you're in films. What is much easier is to go to America and let them do all that. But unfortunately, not possible here.
Yeah, because just to, you know, I hope you won't mind me saying this, but the year before we made the film, we were all set to go virtually, weren't we? And everything was in motion. You got the production office set up in Wardour Street, I think it was, and it was all systems go. Having spent, you know, quite a few years with yourself trying to raise the money, and we were all set to go. And I think it was two or 3 weeks before we'd got the go date. It was all set. I'd spoken to costume people, makeup people, and everything. And then, because of the bank crash, I think it was Bear Stearns, wasn't it, that one of the investors pulled out, and so with 2 weeks before the shoot date, it was stopped.
Well, the trouble with that, of course, when it happens, and it does happen, is that you still have to go on spending money because you make commitments to all sorts of people. I mean, in one case, we had what is called a play-or-pay agreement with an actor for £100,000. So it was £100,000 if he played, and £100,000 if we didn't have the film ready on the date when he was supposed to play. And so we just poured £100,000 down the drain on that. So that is a very difficult part of the industry. But we try not to think about it. It's like childbirth. Once you've been through it, you hope you've forgotten it. And otherwise you wouldn't be able to do it again, if you see what I mean.
Well, I was absolutely amazed, because when that happened, I thought, well, that is the end. But I've never met anybody more dogged, determined, sense of conviction than you. I mean, to kind of pull it back from that, and then the following year we're off again and we actually do it. I think it's amazing. But, you know, I mean, maybe that, because that world to me is completely alien. That would have completely floored me, and that would have been the end.
Well, it is a fairly common experience. Orson Welles had about 3 films running, which he'd shot a little bit of, and then he had to close it down because there wasn't the money didn't arrive, and so it went on. You know, there are a lot of producers and directors, particularly ones who work with British films or European films, who have that problem. But let's not think about the money.
No. The theme of both the Wicker Man and the Wicker Tree, have you always been fascinated by that? You know, the paganism versus Christianity. Has that always been something that's fascinated you?
Well, I'm very interested in comparative religion. And not long before we made The Wicker Man, I had read a lot of, because there are 15 volumes, I think, of Fraser's Golden Bough.
Right, yeah.
Which is an amazing kind of detective story going back through all the religions almost to the first moment. And interestingly enough, Apocalypse Now, if any of you have seen that extraordinary film, Coppola has Brando. They go up the Mekong River, and the Americans are wiping out various villages on the way, and the marvelous scenes in which the helicopters charge at their enemy to the sound of the Ride of the Valkyries. But at the very end of the film, you come to this person, in a way it's a steal from Conrad's Heart of Darkness, holed up, he's an American, like the final character in The Golden Bough. He cannot sleep. He waits till his successor comes to kill him. And he has to keep awake, and he has to keep awake because that's going to happen. And actually, rather, I thought, tastelessly, difficult word to use here, Coppola actually had the Golden Bough on his table. Nudge, nudge, look, look, you know, this is what this is about. But to answer your question, there is so much that makes marvelous stories in that book that you could go on forever. And we've used just little bits and pieces of it. The other thing I should say, which I think may interest some people who've seen both films, is that Tony Shaffer, who wrote the screenplay for the first film, and I were partners making television films and commercials and things for about 14 years. And he was a great games player. And he would plot terrible practical jokes on other people. And he expected them to be played back on him. In other words, it was a kind of life game that he played. The master of this in our particular circle was Stephen Sondheim, you know, the songwriter. And when I first met Tony, he came over because I had been lucky enough to win a prize, and a big advertising agency in London wanted to put me in business in London, and I've been working in New York up until then. And so they sent him to be my producer and salesperson. And when he arrived, he came to my apartment block just off Park Avenue in New York. And those apartment blocks have a doorman, sometimes 2 doormen, an elevator man, and a back elevator man, and all these people who make sure that someone doesn't come bursting through your door with a gun. I mean, it's a sort of whole profession in New York. And what they would never do is let somebody in who they didn't have a good reason to let in. So I was astounded when I heard a knocking on my door, and I opened the door and saw Tony Schaffer, and by the way, he subsequently wrote Sleuth, which is one of the great games playing. And I said, "Who are you?" And he said who he was. I said, "How the hell did you get in here?" He said, "I told them I was CIA, and I was investigating you as a comsimp, because it was the time of the McCarthy hearings." Now, to be actually convicted of being a comsimp would have got me out of the apartment, in 5 minutes. And so I was furious. And finally, I dragged him in front of, I don't know, the head porter or somebody, and he said I was just joking. Well, we know Mr. Hardy is not a comsimp. So that was the first game he played on me. And over the years, we played a whole series of games against each other. And they, in many ways, are the genesis of these films. Because for instance, not to bore you with more of these, but I mean, there was one in which, this was my revenge for one of his more heinous attempts. We were shooting in Puerto Rico on a hacienda coffee plantation, and he had landed in San Juan and was coming up to see us, and I'd sent a jeep for him, and the jeep got as far as our gate. Well, our gate to our hacienda was about 100 yards away, no more, and I had waiting for him a farmhand with a mule. And I was taking advantage of the fact he's rather short-sighted, and he couldn't, of course, see the hacienda up the drive, but we could see him. And he was raised in sort of arboreal Hampstead, where he'd never been on a horse, probably betted on them, but never gone near one. And he had to ride this because the Peer didn't speak a word of English. And there was a leading rein, at least. And we watched him, in the hills around us for several hours, struggling with this mule. Mule wasn't at all pleased anyway to have him. And eventually he got back to the gate, and he saw us coming down with a gin and tonic in our hands for him. He was very, very displeased. And I felt that was one of my better ones. But I mean, so, you can see there's that mind behind these. These are games. The journey through them are seeded with clues. I mean, the film you've just watched has God knows how many clues as to what's going on the way to the scene where they reverse, the power of the blood. And so I think that's a very important ingredient in the films.
The other thing I'm curious about is after the Wicker Man, you did another film, didn't you, the Fantasist, which, I mean, if you haven't seen it, I mean, you get a copy. I think it's a great film. And after that one, which I think was, 79, something like that, then the big break until this one.
Well, you remember I've written something like 6 novels in that time. Been married 5 times.
Yeah.
Have 8 children.
So, yeah, it's a wonder that you had time to do any films then, yeah, really. I mean, the Fantasist, I thought I really enjoyed that film. Were you pleased with that one?
Yes, it's in my way. It's not anything to do with the other films, and it's completely different. And it's based on a book by Patrick McGinley, who's a wonderful Irish writer. And Patrick had a lot of fun sending up the island of the EU. I mean, the European Union, when and all its implications and all its benefits hit Ireland, it changed Dublin dramatically. And in a way, it became, a lot of people became very pretentious and so on and so forth. And McGinley made a lot of fun of this. And so that's the background to the film. But the film is a thriller. It's a straight thriller.
No, it's very good. I really enjoyed it. So let's ask the audience if they've got any questions that they'd like to put to Robin or myself, if you've got anything for me. Yeah.
Why Americans?
Sorry?
Sorry, quite unlike the previous film, there was the two star Americans and this one. Was it anything to do with financing? Or is that
No, nothing. No, nothing to do with Americans. It's really that the United States, which obviously I know very well, is probably the most, I mean, if Saudi Arabia is the center of the most retrograde form of Islam, the southern states of the United States, the same thing could be said about Christianity. So it's very interesting to me to see how this, how people from that particular background behave when they're faced with a world which they just can't begin to understand. And I mean, you get it with Mr. Romney when he comes over for his, his PR trip before his election, or rather his candidature. A total misunderstanding of what's going on. And a lot of it based on religious beliefs. And so I couldn't think of any other country. I mean, I couldn't have done it with a couple of Venezuelans. I couldn't have done it, with a couple of Haitians. It wouldn't have worked. But it does work with them because we are sufficiently familiar with the literature of that world. I mean, we've, most of us read Carson McCullers and all those, wonderful Southern, Tennessee Williams, and so it's accessible to us to have people like that. And also, I think it's very important, and I've tried, and I hope you will agree that this was successful in this, not to make them villains. I mean, these two young people are innocent in the real sense of the word. And yet they have these strange beliefs. And they believe them absolutely as if they'd learned them by rote, which they probably have. So that's why.
I can't see. Yeah.
Given that in most film schools, Wicker Man is thrust in front of your film student and said, this is filmmaking, this is what it's all about. With that hanging in the background some 30, 40 years ago, when you made this film, did you start off from the point that this is a standalone story and a standalone film without the original Wicker Man having any effect on it?
No, I don't think we did. I don't think we had any idea that it was going to be anything like as successful as it was. And interestingly enough, its success was born in the United States, not over here. Although it did win a big prize in Europe before we took it to the States. But the British distributors tried to bury it completely. They thought they couldn't understand it. What the hell was it about? And all these songs and this sex and there's no proper horror. Where's the blood? I mean, it was a disaster from their point of view. The head of British Lion said to Christopher Lee, I think it's one of the worst films I've ever seen, and it's completely undistributable. Christopher then put the film under his arm and went to France and won a Grand Prix for it, whereupon the British critics had to look at it. But at that point, I couldn't wait to get back to the United States, where, frankly, you see, the interesting thing is that in the early 70s, this country had really passed out of the film era completely. All the cinemas have been made into bingo halls or Nelly Hall. The average person, the average sort of middle-class person, for instance, if you ask them how many times they went to the cinema, they would say, well, maybe one, because there was a big Disney picture or something, or Gone with the Wind was being repeated for the third time. That was it. Whereas the United States, which even then had something like 5,000 film departments in their various universities, to not have seen lots and lots of films like reading lots and lots of books was to be illiterate. That's a big contrast with their religiosity, interestingly enough. But here, film was, why would you go to one of those? You should be reading a book or going to a theatre. There was a kind of snobism against it. And so I think that when we made The Wicker Man, we were lucky, in fact, we had sort of virgin soil to work on. Here was a film which was about something which didn't fit into any of the then usual popular molds, and as a result, the critics loved it because there was so much to write about. I mean, the thing with the critics is you should make a good film, but really, above all, you should give it plenty to write about. And they did. But in the United States, the film was really taken to people's hearts, and the reviews were absolutely amazing.
I mean, did you think when it had such a kind of a bumpy start, if you like, that, would you have thought that 40 years on, it would have reached the kind of iconic status that it has reached?
I didn't expect to be around 40 years.
I mean, because that is incredible, isn't it? I mean, like, slow starting, bumpy, but now it's...
Well, yes, but you see, it had a full life in the United States all those years, and here on television it was being repeated really often. At least I wasn't here, but I'm told that was the case. When DVD arrived, well, it was video before DVD, it was a natural kind of bestseller, and it remained so.
I mean, just, like a personal story. I mean, when we first met and worked together, which I was trying to work it out, I mean, it's probably 20 years when I did my first job with you, and the producer said to me, it was, in fact, a training thing for Security Corps, but and the producer said to me, we've got a big shot film director, his words, not mine, big shot film director directing this, and I was playing the lead in this film, and so I said, don't tell me what is done, because I don't want to be intimidated by that. I don't want to know, so tell me after, when we've finished. So a week or so later, after we'd finished, and we were having a drink at the end of the shoot, and I said to the producer, I said, okay, what's he done? And he said, The Wicker Man. And this is my ignorance, and I said, never heard of it, which was true. I then went and managed to get a copy, and I'm glad that I hadn't known that when we were doing it, because I think I would have been like this. But so I was glad, and that was quite a thing. But yeah, so I know. I mean, I can see in this country, probably, I mean, 20 years ago, I mean, I hadn't heard of it, but now, I mean, it's
interesting how, I mean, every college, university in this country has a media department now. Film is treated very much like literature. You've seen Branner's films, and you can comment on them the same as you comment on, I don't know, Jane Austen or something like that in English lit. It's caught up to some degree. I'm exaggerating, but you can see what I mean. And as a result, television. I mean, I personally think that, and this is very interesting for me because I think a film like you've just seen is a short story. It's not a novel. It's got enough characters, enough incident, and enough atmosphere, I hope, to interest you for as long as a short story might. But the great novels at the moment are being written on television. West Wing, for instance. And the Americans, well, you have to admit, I think are writing some of the best of them. And the Danes, I don't know if any of you are watching the Danish contributions, which are extremely good. But the Americans are, with their teams of writers, are doing amazing work, I think. And we are running to catch up in many cases here. But I'm no doubt we will catch up because we have wonderful writers too.
I was very interested in your depiction of the mummified or embalmed corpses of the former queens of the May, because I have witnessed personally in Ghana, in West Africa, a funeral in which a corpse was exhibited in a very similar, well, an identical manner actually, enrobed like a bride, if you like, waiting to meet death. And she was greeted by members of the family, the extended family, and by complete strangers such as myself. I was lucky to be invited. But I wondered where you got this wonderful sort of correspondence with the reality in another part of the world altogether.
Well, again, the Golden Bough is, Fraser's Golden Bough is full of this stuff. I mean, for instance, and slightly away from that, priestly robes, I mean, Roman Catholic, Anglican, mainly, and other priests, wear clothes which we might say were feminine. They're much more like dresses. The Aztecs used to kill a girl, again, probably the most beautiful, the cleverest, the most loved girl, because this question of having a victim who is most likely to be acceptable to the gods. And they skinned her, literally skinned her, and the priest would wear her skin. And that, in a way, was an origin of the female dress for priests in some societies. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't something that St. Peter was sending out as an advisory for his successors, but there is a tradition of that. And all over the world, it's rather like the wheel, except I think Peru, being invented coincidentally in different parts of the world, almost simultaneously. And in religion, I think the same kind of idea as well. We're all human. We all are credulous in different ways. We all fear. I mean, the speech I've given to the laird, where he says, and I think, we living in effect, we're living in northwest Europe, where the shortest day, the sun sets, and how are we to know that it's going to go on rising again and again and again? Well, our ancestors didn't know, for sure. And the difference between their winter and their summer and their longest day was huge. And they must quite naturally have thought there must be some agent somewhere, whether up there or down there or wherever, who made sure that the sun went on coming up. And so the speech that the lad makes to the journalists is not so ridiculous, really, about the sun.
I think we're going to have to wind it up now, but just on a kind of a lighter note, I'd just like to recount a little anecdote involving Robin and myself. we both lived in Mells. Robin still does, I don't anymore. And it's just to illustrate how life imitates art, if you like. One night, kind of early hours of the morning, sort of 12:30, midnight, I don't know if you remember this, Robin, but midnight, 1 o'clock, I was sitting, I hadn't gone to bed, I was just sitting in my living room, strumming away on my guitar. And I heard an alarm sounding, and I thought maybe it was the post office in the village where we live, in Mells. I thought maybe the post office had been broken into, as it had been several times. So I thought, well, I'll go out and have a look and see what's going on. Anyway, so I walk out, absolutely deserted, nobody about, but there's an alarm sounding, which in fact wasn't the post office, but it was a house on the corner, on the sort of triangle. And I'm just looking at that, and it's starting to rain a bit, and I just look around, nobody about, and then I see somebody walking towards me, and it's Robin. And so the two of us are standing in the middle of the road in Mells at sort of 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. And Robin said, well, I think those people are away. Do you remember this, Robin? And the burglar alarm was going off. We should go and investigate. And I'm thinking, no, I don't think so. We'll just leave it. So, but Robin, he's off. And he's, you know, no, we're going to have a look. So I said, but if there are people in there, then they might hurt us, you know, so let's leave it. But no, Robin's there looking in the windows. Anyway, when we kind of realised that actually there was nobody in there, so it was probably a faulty burglar alarm, but we weren't sure, so Robin said, we'll ring 999. So we went back to your house, and I think we had a whiskey. And anyway, then Robin rang 999, and he's on the phone, and he's saying, yes, I'd like to report a suspected burglary in the village where I live. And they said, yes, and it's Mells, the village of Mells, yes. So I think you should send a police officer to investigate. And then, obviously, they said, what's your name? And you know, Robin said, yes, my name, Hardy, Robin Hardy. At which point I thought, if that person on the other end of the phone was a film buff, and they were a fan of the Wicker Man, there's no way they would have sent a policeman out. But I thought, what a bizarre thing, you know what I mean? I thought, you know, anyway, yeah. But just very briefly, before you wind up, John, I'd just like to say a personal thank you, Robin, for giving me the chance to be in that great film. So thank you.
Well, thank you and the Raven.
Yeah.
Robin, thanks very much for putting together a very interesting evening tonight. We've been absolutely fascinated by your tales of filmmaking together. And Robin, you must have got enough anecdotes to fill several volumes of autobiographies. So come and tell us some more next time. You didn't even get round to Mark Bolan.
No, that's true.
Thanks for showing the film, and we're all quite relieved to see it wasn't too mainstream. So thanks for both of you for putting your time.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.